Good morning, guys. Want to touch base with you guys. Looking at some of your posts that you guys did last night, you've taken a lot of the suggestions that I gave you and you've implemented them. So that's everything's looking really good. So I want to take a quick second, just kind of, I wasn't sure how, when people who have not been in corrections would really understand the difference between jails and prisons. And the lines for jails is becoming more blurred as prisons are finding themselves being overpopulated and having too many inmates. The incarceration rates obviously are skyrocketing more and more as Congress and as each state is defining laws that are definitely more stringent on the population. So when I first began in '95 in law enforcement, I started at the Buncombe County Jail. And so at that point, obviously, the difference between jails and prisons in '95 was that jails were a pretrial detainee facility, and people would go on that would be held for court if they couldn't make bond. And so then they would be adjudicated, and if they were found guilty, obviously they would then go to prison. Depending on the length of time that they were having to serve. Example, for misdemeanors, it's 150 days or less. So typically, if it was beyond 150 days, they would go on to DOC. And so let's just stop there for a second. So why would it be more than 150 days if it was a misdemeanor? So generally they would have two different ways of being sentenced if they had multiple misdemeanors. One, that their crimes could run concurrent, right? So let's just say you had 3 misdemeanors and you got sentenced to 150 days on those misdemeanors, so that they would, rather than running consecutively, which means that, all right, so you're going to serve 150 days for your first misdemeanor, 150 days for your second misdemeanor, and 150 days for your third misdemeanor, for a total of 450 days, right? So it's more than a year. So that would be consecutive. To run them concurrently would mean to take all 3 of those misdemeanors and run them at the same time. If that was the case, generally jails would house those people for less than 180 days. So, and then came a time that we had what were called statewide misdemeanor confinement programs. So basically, that the counties would house inmates who were sentenced to go to do DOC, and they would be housed at the local jails. So you now had this intermixing of inmates who were not sentenced and those who were sentenced. So it really created some different situations for administrations within jails and for officers who were keeping those inmates and trying to work. So there were actually, from 1995 now, let's talk about the different housing styles. And you've all read about first generation, second generation, and third generation. So I was fortunate enough to work in all 3 of those iterations of facilities. Get a cup of coffee real quick. So the first generation would be the linear style. So there may be some confusion as to how inmates and officers were able to interact during this time. So let's just say you had 8 cells, generally housing 2 inmates per cell. So you would have 8 cells, 16 people on a cell block. So generally speaking, during waking hours, which could be whatever, right? So let's just say it's from 8 to 10 that night, right? So 8 a.m., 10 p.m. So during that time, you had general hours. So all of the doors would slide forward and all the inmates would come out. Now, obviously, in the linear style, there's not a lot of room for walking back and forth. They would have some TV privileges. They would have a phone that 16 people would have to share. So there created a lot of challenges. there's obviously very little rec, but inmates would generally do push-ups, sit-ups, and whatever if they wanted to get some physical activity. Very limited style. Officers would obviously communicate or take care of whatever they need. Feeding was done through the bars. Officers generally never went inside the cell block unless, of course, there was a problem. So, so it was more difficult to, if there was a fight, to get into the cell block, which created a lot of issues. In that style of management, it was the officer interacted with one another. The inmates interacted limited in that setting. And so we would find a lot of contraband, obviously, because there was not a lot of supervision. All right, so that was the first style. Second generation was, let's think about this. All right, so when you think about second generation, it's more if you were in a dorm, right? So if you were in college, you're in a dorm setting, and so all of the inmates are in there together. So there's a lot of socialization going on in that environment. The challenge is that it's a very indirect way of supervising for officers to inmates. Now, it's a lot more easy to get into that dormitory setting than it was to get into the linear style setting. And also, you didn't have direct supervision 24 hours a day. All right, so that's the second generation. Third iteration would be the direct supervision. Now, that's if I'm not sure how many counties have direct supervision, but let's just say now it is remain the dormitory style, but now the officer is in with the inmates. And so in Buncombe County Jail, we had 46 cells. Every cell was individualized. Let me go back just a second. So the second generation, the dormitory style bunk beds, probably 80 to 100 inmates in those. Third generation, 46 cells, one inmate per cell. And so they could go to their cell, close the door, isolated, and I say isolated, it's very secure. Inmate violence went down significantly from the first two iterations. So it was very disconcerting in the very beginning to go from either a first generation style to a third generation style if you didn't work in that dormitory style as an officer, because now you're going into a housing unit where the door is locked behind you in with 46 inmates. So that was, in the beginning, depending on your style of management towards inmates would determine your level of safety and security. All right, so I want to make sure you guys understood that. So, in these jail settings, one of the things that I want to really bring home to you, in the beginning of my career, I was in these management styles, and especially the first iteration, didn't really understand at 25 years old that, the people coming to jail weren't always bad guys. They were people who had, there was a 50% chance that they had violated or committed a crime. 50% chance, right? So because they'd have to go to a magistrate. The magistrate or an officer would bring an offender to court. A magistrate would oversee a hearing and to determine the probability that the probability that who the officer had arrested had committed the crime that the officer said they committed. Then the magistrate would determine whether or not they were going to set bail, which could be anything from written promise, which meant, hey, look, your court date will be on this date. You need to come. If you don't come, then here's what you're going to have to pay the court. It might be written promise $500 if you fail to appear, right? So that would be one. It might be $500 secured, might be $500 unsecured. If you have any challenges with these concepts, please reach out. So if the person who was being arrested couldn't make bail, then they would be held in the jail setting until time that they would go to court to be adjudicated. So what I had a challenge with is in the very beginning was understanding, okay, well, there's a probability that they're guilty. it's a higher probability that they're guilty. So I went ahead and assumed that they were guilty based on the fact that they were there. So the real reason is they're there is because they can't afford. Poverty has really taken an impact and an effect on their situation more than possibly their guilt, right? So I'm giving you kind of that space in which to go, hey, it's a 50-50 chance that they're in jail because they committed the crime and because they are guilty. Anyway, so I'm hoping that you guys, this is brings some clarity. So in the latter half of my career, when I went back into corrections, I'd gone through some different things, and I began to realize that the people that are in jail are generally more like me. And the reason I say they're more like me is because I realize I make some bad decisions because I am sinful, because I am, at my core, I am no better than my last sin, right? Other than the sanctifying blood of Jesus. And I have to understand that, and that maybe the person that I'm dealing with in jail has not had that redemptive power of Jesus work in their life yet. So I have to be gracious enough to understand they may not have that. But I also need to understand that while they're under my care and waiting to go to court, that I hold them accountable for the rules. Not because they need to understand, okay, rules are something a part of life, but they need to understand that the rules are there for their benefit. Much like the law in the Old Testament is not to keep us from something, but to show benefit, to keep us from harm. And so a lot of times, the rules in the facility are not just to prove, hey, we're in charge, that there's a power dynamic, but to help them to be able to be safe and secure during their time with us. And understanding that there are rules. So hopefully all of this is not too much. Hopefully you understand it. Hopefully it brings some clarity to some things. If it doesn't, hey, please reach out and we'll do another one. But I want to let you guys know you're doing a fantastic job with your posts. I really have enjoyed reading them. It's showing some insight, especially if you've never done this, that you guys can get a real grasp, what's happening in a facility. Because one of the things that I have seen is you guys have talked a lot about mental health, the mental health aspect. And so that if you've got mental health coming in, it's usually exacerbated. There are times that if you come into a setting without mental health, that isolation from loved ones can impact your mental health. For sure. So you guys have pointed some of that stuff out. So that's great work. Keep up the in-text citations. I just want to take just a brief second to talk about it. If you're not, you can have an opinion, right? There's nothing wrong with an opinion. It needs to be an informed opinion. And so that informed opinion is based on best evidence, right? So evidentiary stuff. So make sure that you are not only just coming with an opinion, but showing the science behind your opinion. All right. So you guys are doing a great job. Look forward to hearing from you. If there's anything I can do, just reach out to me. Thanks.